we will be all set
Mitch
with
Miller
has joined the meeting.
And next time I will make sure to remove the audio feature for saying your name so we can just hear everybody that's present and not the announcement. So welcome again. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you and go ahead and present this as I need to. So we are looking at the feedback session. All three sessions have been really helpful, and hopefully they've been helpful for you in your teaching so that you can be able to make some reflective adjustments or maybe just some validations for the work that you've been doing with regard to this feedback process. So I don't believe Carol is joining us this afternoon, but if you need additional assistance, you can always call or email Carol or I, and we'd be happy to help you and really support you in this process. So we're looking at the feedback loops today, and so our objectives are really to build that strong collaborative network. It's really been an emphasis of ours this time around, making sure that we're supporting you and that you feel supported by your co-faculty, your program officials, and your deans to be able to help you develop professionally. Content-wise, we'll be looking at the feedback loop using data, so really a data-driven conversation. And if you're using data to help with your instruction, I am welcoming you to the conversation with open arms. I'll be talking about it a little bit, but I hope that many of you have a lot more information to share. And then we're going to do a little bit of reflection. If you want to keep your action plan open, because that will be your reflection document, as well as I will have an attendance link so that you can provide additional feedback to us on how we're doing to support your efforts with student learning and quality teaching. So really simple objectives for today. So we've invested quite a bit of time in this feedback session. So
has joined the meeting.
I just want to share with you, again, a revisiting of what that process is. So the first part, we did 2 sessions on Feed Up, and that's really ensuring that students understand the purpose of the assignment, the task or lesson, and you created your action plan from that. So that was basically, I want to establish better transparency in the announcement, or a lot of you created video. And so you decided on some feed-up measures that you wanted to incorporate, really being more transparent in that social dialogue with students about the expectations. And then we spent 3 sessions looking at feedback, really using the grade center, and then not so much discussion boards, but really in the summative sense that provides students with information about their needs and successes. And we talked about relating that to criteria within rubrics if your course has those embedded. And we talked about some strategies, questions, posing new content, resources. And now we'll be looking at Feed Forward, just a single session, but equally important as the others as we finish up that feedback loop. And this is really guiding students based on performance data. So we'll be looking at some charts and some numbers to be able to make informed decisions. So I prepared a simple sample here. And this is
has joined the meeting.
4 weeks of data that we have collected on 3 students is really what we're looking at. So just a small snippet. And if we could just open the dialogue, or what are some things that you see? What are some things that you notice about these 3 students' data? If you could just chime into the chat box and really just kind of state what you see in maybe a sentence or 2 about one or all of the students. So we have student A, student B, and student C. So this is a discussion board / engagement worth of 15 points. If I can give you the context, and we're looking at 3 weeks of data and to kind of see what's going on with these students. So perhaps we have students. Which 2 students are you referring to, Linda? I'm assuming it's student B and student A. They've just lost interest. Okay, and what data are you seeing that would help you think that they lost interest? And maybe we're seeing 3 different students on 3 different tracks here. That's what Stephen suggests. so remember that we're looking at this too with the lens of just what you see. So for example, I see or I notice student A score a 12 the first week, and then a 15, and then a 13 at 12. That would be just what I see. That's the data, okay? And then if I want to look at it specifically, I might say student A had, like a B-type performance, then excellent performance, and then back to kind of average, and then lower, okay? So we can look at this from a progression standpoint as well. So Stephen also mentions there could be external factors, and that's what I want you to keep in mind, is that just as the data is presented, we do not know those external factors. All we have is the data that's in front of us. So that would be first and foremost as we're considering, this, where do we go next is really the decision that we're trying to determine. Where do I need to go next as the instructor, and where does the student need to go next? And Phyllis chimes in and she says, student C has progressed since week 1, okay? So that is true. We can see that. The blue says, even from week 2, we can see the progression. Student B has declined each week, and student A has peaked and then declined. Okay, so that's a great way to kind of consolidate and but also individualize the data that we see. And then Jim also says, too, so we're declining in engagement. So there are a lot of contextual issues that we can think upon and reflect upon. So, what did I do in week 1? What did I do in week 2? So we need to consider us first, the instructor, as far as what did I do, and then how did the students respond to that? And the data will really kind of reveal some of those things put together. I'm going to share with you another chart here, and just to give you an idea of how to maybe look at rubric criteria as it relates to performance. So just to give you some context, there was one discussion question focused on criteria 1. So this is also an indicator, thinking about how am I aligning my discussion questions really to the rubric expectations, okay? And then 3 additional threads were not aligned to any additional criteria. They were just, conversation points. So this, we actually have 5 students that we're looking at, and I've grouped this into criteria. So what are some things we might notice about criteria 1 with those 5 students? And there are really no wrong answers. We're just kind of sharing what we notice. So for example, someone might say, I noticed 2 students scored perfectly, and 2 students just almost under perfect, and then 1 student, scored an 8, okay? What else might you see as some of the other criteria, in addition to maybe criteria 1 that I didn't mention? Okay, so Steve also says there is a level of engagement with the individual criteria. Remember, we're talking about, rubric criteria here. So yes, but that criteria 1 seems to be the most engaging. Can I say that safely? That criteria 1 seems to be the most engaging, or students perform best in criteria 1. Okay, thanks, Steve. What's going on with criteria 2? So we might be, what would be some processes that we want to think about as we're looking at this data, specifically with criteria 2, and maybe even with individual students? So the conversation gets, kind of muddy based on the criteria itself, based on our instructional approaches, based on what we know with individual students. And so this might be an example of how you might collect some of the data, some of the platforms that we have available as far as analyzing data. And I'd be curious to know if there are other faculty that kind of collect data on their own. I know I've had conversations with some of them. Phyllis says maybe they just didn't understand the criteria for which one? Criteria 2, I'm guessing, because there were some low performers. Yes, thanks, Linda. And so, with that in mind, what would be the next step? So we might want to think about looking at criteria 2 and what's going on with criteria 2. And I want to point out, too, that remember that we had a discussion question for criteria 1. Maybe, as we're looking at this data, I put more instructional emphasis on criteria 1 than I did the other criteria. Yeah, thanks, Felina. And saying that criteria 2 could be the accuracy of the assignment, and some students might find that the assignments are difficult. So that's a really good point. Maybe there's content in there that instructionally was kind of glazed over, or maybe the instructional supports weren't necessarily as rich as some of the other criteria. So it's giving us some reflective opportunities. I like what Joe said, so that there might be a dispersion of student population. Maybe you have some students at the end of their program and some at the beginning, okay? And so how does that maybe influence my instructional decision? So that's a good point, and saying that I have students here and students there, but at the same time, how do I feed both of those populations of students forward? Maybe one is more closely related to the learning objectives. That's a good point. And so how do I fill that gap as the instructor? Okay, and the limited amount of time. So I'm going to show you another example of how to look at this from a student perspective. Okay, so we looked at this from the criteria perspective, exact same data, but what do I maybe notice about the student perspective? What are some things that I can assess based on individual students? Now remember, I can still differentiate my instruction and say, I want to focus more attention on maybe these 2 or 3 students as opposed to the others, and there's ways to do that. Okay. Maybe pick a student and make some data feedback or data comments related to what you see. And let's make the assumption that these criteria are out of 10 points, that there are some students that are, receiving all points, and there are some students that are below that. So I really think it's important to note, too, that this criteria 1 seems to get the best traction of all of these. So as we're making our decisions for instruction, thinking, when you design instruction to feed students forward and say, I'm going to create discussion questions or learning opportunities specifically related to the criteria and rubrics, and that helps kind of launch students into that learning. And this data would validate that, whereas in the other threads, they weren't necessarily attached to any specific rubric criteria or maybe even SLOs, and now we see the student data to validate that. There will be a time later in this presentation, probably in the next 10 minutes or so, for us to actually access some of that classroom data so that you can start making some of those decisions and see maybe if your hunches are correct or maybe new revelations are being present, okay? So when we think about the benefits of feed forward, that means the benefits of looking at data, we realize that feedback and feed forward also focus on the processes that students use as learners and thinkers. Remember we talked about self-monitoring, self-regulating. This is not about enabling students. This is about providing them with the support and processes to help them be more independent thinkers and independent academics. But some need teaching and some need prodding, especially if they're going through different courses and they experience different instructors. So we're really trying to close that gap. Teachers provide students with examples of self-generated thoughts, feelings, and actions that are planned and cyclically adapted. So that's where that closing of the feedback loop comes in. You've planned, you've provided the feedback, and then what are you doing to now plan again to adapt for students to be able to learn again? And I would like to provide you with the link that I have there from the AFCD so that I can share with you, and I will do that momentarily. So how do you access data within your course in order to feed your students forward and your instruction forward? So you can follow along with me if you want to open up a new screen, but there will be time to do that. So within your grade center, and you have your different grades here, you will notice the title of the assignment, and there's a little arrow pull down. And if you open that up, you'll see what's called a rubric evaluation report. And when you open that up, the screen will come up, and you have the opportunity, it's very simple, to download your report. You can use PDF, HTML, Excel, or Word. And then you can choose the date range. I'll be honest with you, I didn't even mess with the date range when I compiled the report. I just left it as it is. So you don't really need to. And then you hit submit. Okay, so there's about 3 steps involved with that. And so what we'll calculate is if you have rubrics attached to that specific assignment, you can see the overall performance. So this is out of 50. And you can see that this class that I chose, the average score was a 45.95. So it's about an A. Okay? The report will also share with you statistics related to the different criteria. So it breaks it up into the criteria, and you can see content question 1, so on and so forth, and it will provide for you what the possible answers. This is all the students aggregated together that completed the assignment, and it will show you what they actually scored as a whole, so the average here, all right? So this one I like the best, actually, this data here, is it shows you, the way that you scored it. It doesn't show the feedback that you provided, but the way that you scored it, the number of students that actually completed it, and the average, the median, and the mode, okay? So these are, the top scores here, and then the standard deviation, which is really the gap, the greatest gap that you can see between, the final for the assignment total and then what you scored. So we can notice here that question 5 looks like the widest standard deviation and that actually has the lowest average score. So what we might want to think about is looking at question 5. We can even look at individual student responses for that particular question. And we can think about, what made the difference between an excellent and an incomplete or partial, okay? And we can make some assumptions. We can also make some really observant data analysis conversations to be able to engage in what's really going on with students. So you're taking an in-depth look to be able to look at the data and see what it's speaking to you. Equally so, this might be an area of movement where, okay, 82%, that's really great. 80% of my students are in this range for question number 1 and question number 2. Okay? So I want to give you the practice opportunity to look at some of this data within your course. And if you're calling in, you can just be patient, or, if you have the accessibility to do that, that's great too. So access the assignment to review. Remember, we looked in the Grade Center, and using that little pull-down menu at the assignment title, and look for the assignment that said, or the tab that says Rubric Evaluation Report, and then you would run the report on whatever platform you wanted to, PDF, Word, what have you, and then take a look at that pop-up that comes up. And so I'd love to hear your feedback in the chat box in terms of what you're noticing about the analytics on that. If there are any aha moments, did you know that this report existed? And then we'll kind of go from there. So I'm going to hit mute for just a moment. Feel free to keep the chat box open, and I'm going to give you some time to be able to look at that report. Okay, so just take another few seconds and we're going to move forward. You know, some things are being revealed in this that, you know, as much as we can do as instructors to be able to support students in looking at data, we also recognize that there may be gaps in the assessments themselves. And I'm glad that Linda felt comfortable in expressing that, and that is something that we rely on our faculty to be able to provide us with feedback. So my statement of, you know, I'll contact your program official in a polite way to express perhaps a little bit of, you know, we need to work on this a little bit more, but also fill out the course evaluation at the end of the semester, which each of you should receive. And so you can always share that with your IES as well, and we can communicate that and work with those program officials to be able to make the proper adjustments to the assessment. And so, you know, they are what they are, so we work with them. So John says, I see that some students are, number one, not engaged enough during the week and don't apply the textbooks. Okay, so I'm making the assumption then, John, that there are criteria specifically related to the textbooks within the rubric. So these are courses that specifically have rubrics within them that we're looking at. And so that's how you will get these reports that I'm showing for you, unless you have other data that you're using to make instructional decisions to be able to feed up. So that is one of my other questions. And so I demonstrated for you one way that we can look at some of the Blackboard data, but what are some other ways to collect student data that will help inform our next steps as we help students feed forward? You know, in your process of looking at how students perform, what are some things that you try or try to look at as far as data points? So John, what data did you use to be able to make the distinction that students were not engaged and they don't apply the textbooks? Because that'll help shape us in terms of what you looked at to be able to make that conclusion. And if anyone else wants to chime in to that conversation. Yeah, so as we're grading, using those rubrics to be able to make determinations on really what the criteria is and how students are performing. Linda, I think I might need a little bit more explanation. I wonder if posing questions to the students about the assignments is appropriate. Could you clarify what you mean by that? And I think that'll kind of help us. Okay, so Stephen kind of generates his own data, it looks like, his own end-of-the-week reflections, and he listens to them and their impressions of the materials in an objective way to kind of make those instructional decisions, I'm assuming. Yeah, so John, I love what you said, that we can tell from their performance how well they read the rubric, and so that leads us to another feed-up strategy, right? We talked earlier about this idea of communicating and opening a dialogue about the rubric. So John, I guess my question for you is, what would you like students to really hone in on as they are reading the rubric? And I'm assuming positive intent there. And that may be a rhetorical question. Okay, so Linda says, you notice how some scores go back and ask their interpretation this time. I try to do that as a feed-up strategy. Okay, so we're starting to see the closure of that feedback loop. Great rubric from Joe. Lessons learned posting, something similar to a reflection. And thanks for your honesty, John, about getting hung up on the details. So that helps us be very metacognitive and reflective of our own practice. Okay. So I wanted to share with you a few of the features in Canvas, and so you're getting firsthand exposure to some of those data points within Canvas, and so this is what that looks like. I just took this from the tutorials that were present. So you see something similar. This is a single student, number of assignments from week to week, and we can see they're using a shapes to be able to make the distinction between when a student puts something online, on time, late, missing, and then assignments not yet posted that are ready to come in the future. So this also is a great trend line for, what's happening with the student along the way, an opportunity to reach out to the student maybe privately, or maybe we're seeing this consistently with students, and then we know it's something we need to make mindful note of. This one here talks about the grades. So they have an individual student with the little shapes again, and where the student performed as it relates to the percentile and the total range of student performance. This is really interesting read, and if you like looking at data like I do, even though I'm not always great at it, it's always interesting to have those conversations with other colleagues. And I really want to encourage that too. We talk so much about these collaborative opportunities. Data should not really be analyzed in isolation. So if you've got a partner here at Baker, or even a objective set of eyes, maybe you work at another institution, that you could say, hey, could you take a look at this data? I'll provide you with some context, but I really want to kind of get your impression of what that might be going on here and where I need to explain a little further. I'm just reading the chat box for a moment there. And it looks like you guys are having great conversation. That the students provided you with feedback, that's great. All right, great. So it looks like you guys are having conversation and building that collaboration. One more feature within Canvas, you can look at whole student analytics. You can look at how many times they viewed. I know within Blackboard, they'll show you, like if you go to your discussion thread initially, and it will show you how many views you have, but it doesn't really say which students viewed, how many times they participated, how many times they submitted, on time, late, missing. And so this gives you just kind of an idea of their habits, their behavioral habits, not necessarily related to grades. And so this is a really interesting piece of data that we can draw on within Canvas, and I'm really looking forward to that transition, and I hope you are too. So let's talk for a moment about this cycle up here on the right. So we're looking at the data, what knowledge do we gain from that data, and really what's the action that we have related to it. So let's look at this from the instructor point of view. What might the data reveal to us? It might reveal that the instructor may need to provide additional information. But that doesn't read right. May need to provide additional information or instruction, really is what is intended to say. And so how do I adjust the way that I'm approaching the information dissemination as well as the instruction? The instructor may need to differentiate the instruction there. It looks like my edits were not as polished as I would like. Instructor may need to ask specific students to elaborate on responses, okay? So what this means is within, let's say we're grading an engagement or discussion question assignment, maybe the instructor is looking at this like, okay, I need to pay attention to these particular students because I'm noticing a trend in their scores. So how can I pull more information out of them? How can I pull more elaborate responses from that? And the instructor may need to group students more deliberately, okay? So the grouping is totally underutilized. But if you think about on ground, sometimes that private grouping with student to student actually promotes greater discussion than if they have the instructor present. And so that's something to play around with. And so I'm noticing that Michael has sent me a private message about late assignments, and you're probably right. Baker does not accept late assignments, although students will try to submit them no matter what. And so while individual faculty have their own leeway, and of course we always make exceptions for extreme circumstances, I think that is good data. When I was showing you before about the Canvas features, that is just notable. And when I say data that's notable, it's recorded. And so that can give us a graphic in terms of when those late assignments are happening and if it's happening too often. And it also tells us as IESs when it's happening too often with an instructor. So that's a really good question, Michael, so thank you. So back to looking at data, what it might reveal on the student's part. Students may need additional instructions. Students may need to review the expectations. I think somebody mentioned it earlier, that they're not reading the rubric. Well, now we can start to see this may be, if I really probe the student, are they reviewing the expectations? Students may need to review the feedback to determine next steps. okay? So this kind of goes back to, I provided the feedback. Did you really look at it? And I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I would really be constructive in thinking about how can I get students to draw back to that feedback. I'm curious to know what other revelations might we be able to contrive from the data, both from the instructor side as well as the student side. Let's try to provide a balance between the two. Okay, thanks, Linda. I appreciate that. Making the determination between announcements and discussion board posting for more effective communication about those different features within Blackboard. So, you know, you pulled up your own data that you have. What are some things that were being revealed to you? And I think somebody mentioned, you know, they're just not reading the rubrics. Okay, so now what? So now what's the action behind that? So if you're starting to think and you have your action plan open, you can start putting those pieces together and really making those reflections within your action plan. Even if it's not necessarily related to your feed up strategy that you initially had reflected upon, maybe this is a new feed up strategy. So my statement of so what wasn't necessarily meant to, you know, hit somebody off guard, but really what's the action that we want to come of it, and so that really will help support us as instructors, but also students. So we don't want to put all the onus on the students, and we don't want to put all the onus on ourselves. There's a striking balance between the two. So other reflections about actions we might need to take based on data that we look at from our students. I know that John has said that he uses Zoom, and thinking about Zoom is a great tool for collaboration and grouping, and how we might be able to record the Zoom or any type of synchronous communications we have with students so that that is actually collecting data. And both you would be able to review that recording, but also the student is able to view that recording too. So you have two people getting the same data and to be able to make those adjustments accordingly. Oh, great, thanks, John. So I want to just have the reminder, you know, that we're looking at these learning structures within our Baker College online learning model. You know, how do we encourage student interaction and eye contact with students and amongst themselves, that we encourage more active learning. So you might say that if looking at the what does the data reveal, that you might need to have more discussion prompts on certain criteria, for example, or you might need to have more engaging dialogue prompts within the discussion board. So there's a lot of opportunities to differentiate the instruction, and the reason I bring this up is this diverse ways of knowing, is that not all students will just read. Sometimes they need video, sometimes they need to collaborate amongst themselves. And so there are a lot of ways that we can look at the data and to make instructional decisions, and I don't think it's fair to say that there is one best practice. So being a reflective teacher is also about this formative process as well. And so Jelena says she uses data from previous classes, okay? So maybe you don't know your students, you're just getting started, and you want to use some of the data trends that you've noticed from course over course, and that's still valid information to be able to use. So, you know, I don't know how many of you would be willing to say that I've never really used data before, and I'll just honestly say it. And I will say as a beginning practitioner, probably for a good 10 years, and I was a teacher for almost 15 years, is that I didn't use data as well as I could have. And certainly with the technology capabilities that we have now, it makes it more accessible to be able to at least gather it and consolidate it for analytical purposes. So when we don't plan instruction based on student performance or that data, we are subject to misconceptions and errors that go undressed and gaps that we know are persistent. So if you're finding yourself in a course where students don't do this and students don't do that, let's look at data to be able to make some, you know, interesting statements about what we're seeing, but also how we can make the adjustments for improvement. We're all about instructional continuous improvement. Thanks for being honest with that, Christina. because I know that that's something that, sharing with you even just a snippet of how we might be able to collect data using the rubrics that are embedded within our course will hopefully help people just be mindful of that the information is available. Okay, so we want to avoid the pitfalls of just ignoring it or saying it's out there. Baker is gearing toward that, so a lot of you have courses that are related to the direct measures, and we're becoming more in tune to the idea that this is good data that maybe is being underutilized, and how can we really use that data to be able to make quality instructional decisions. So, when we look at the data, and I'm not just saying this just to say it, we have been collecting data these entire 6 sessions. So I wanted to share with you some of the data that we've gathered and what that might look like. I use a lot of Google forms to collect data, and you can do that too. You can, do your own data outside of what's available in Blackboard. So, we did like a little pre-assessment. Remember taking that survey, and here are some of the results from that. And the actual, data is not really as important as, just what it might look like. We also collect information on your action plans, like what courses you want to focus on. So we have a good portion of business faculty or business courses that really want to emphasize feedback, that feedback cycle. Part 2, I understand the 3-pronged process. We have a good, great, we're hitting our target. Nobody said no, they don't understand what it is. So that was good. The feedback sessions offer collaborative opportunities. You remember I've asked that quite a few times. And this was from, I think, probably session 2 of part 2 of Feed Up, or maybe even feedback that I was asking this. I asked this a lot because I want to see some trends and make sure that we're having these collaborative spaces. Where did you primarily provide feedback? This is another pre-assessment. This gave us some information as far as this is where people gravitate to, and that people don't use feedback groups. Maybe we want to provide professional development on that, how that can be helpful. Okay. And then more recently, we've also collected narratives. Okay, some of you mentioned reflections, which is great data. And I could go through here in the forum and kind of highlight or maybe even search for specific language in there that I want to pay attention to or that I was expecting students to see those. These are all great data points. So we have been doing our due diligence in terms of not just saying this is good instruction, but even in professional development, we've been enforcing it as well. So really what are some things that we would like for you to do next is, with your students, maybe you want to share the data results and analysis. You could post it as an announcement. You could direct students to review their data and their feedback. These are all feed up strategies, okay? So the part of feed forward is really thinking about how am I using data and where do I want to go next, and then it kind of returns to the feed up, and this is where I am going next. Maybe adjust the instructional approaches, emphasize diverse ways of knowing. You can add multimedia resources and different types of questions. We mentioned that. And maybe contact individual students. The notice of concern, although it's making some adjustments in its process, is still a reliable process that Baker has, really worked to refine to support students where they are. And we even talked about creating student groups. And I will tell you, Canvas is awesome for creating groups. So, is thinking about, this is a slide from the original Feed Up. If you were with us, and most of you were, how can I establish intent, communicate, provide an action and feedback for my students? So again, referring back to that Feed Up, where do I want to go next to provide students with those strategies? And I think we're at the point where if you've had your action plan open and thinking about, okay, I want to just jot some ideas down for myself, and you would do that in your reflection highlights. Some of your reflections are like 4 or 5 pages. Your action plans are 4 or 5 pages, and I haven't had a chance to read all of them. But if you'd like to invite me to provide you with additional feedback based on what's going on, I'd be more than happy to, and that's what we're here for. But in doing so, think about at the reflection highlights, maybe some screenshots of what you're collecting. I've shown you some examples of screenshots of what we're collecting. Reflect on the data analytically, both positive and maybe negative factors. We're not perfect. I know teachers are in the realm of we like to control and we like to think that we're without fault, but truly, I'll admit, you know, data was not something that I looked at during my first years as a teacher. And then think about how we can plan for instructional approaches. So with that in mind, I'm going to share with you the Google attendance within the chat box, but I also want to invite you to our final focus group. And for those of you that haven't fully completed all of the training within these sessions, that's okay. You still have time to be able to do that. I hope this is correct. There we go. And you should see the attendance form in the chat box. But if you stay committed to like 4 out of the 6, I invite you to the focus group because, again, we're collecting this data. We want to be able to make some publications, and I'm doing a presentation at McCall, which is Michigan Association for Computer Users for Learning. And so that feedback is so helpful and so important to us as an institution, being mindful of our professional development opportunities, but also mindful of your growth and the strides that you make and the great things that you do in the classroom for our students. So please let me know if you do not see the link for attendance in the chat box. And if you are calling in, if you would just send me a quick email letting me know that you were not able to access that, and I will provide it for you individually. If you'd like to, we are recording this, and so I will be sharing the recording in the next couple of days and making it public on our professional development website, which I also want to support you with, and showing you that we have a slew of additional professional development offerings within the next few weeks. And so we've got our teach model, which is another, it's not really cohort driven, but it has parts 1, parts 2, and there are several sessions available. And so we wanted to engage you with that. And if you wanted to look at any of the previous sessions for the feedback, here we go, professional development and feedback sessions, it's right here. All of these recordings are still available, and it will link you up so that I can give you credit for all of these sessions. So I will, looks like I need to open the access for the Google Doc, and I will do that momentarily, and I apologize for that. My only thing is that you do need to log on to your Baker account in order to access the attendance. So that would be one issue that you might be having with that. Please let me know if there's any other issues that you have, Stephen, after you try that approach. I'm going to stay on the line for just a little bit longer. If you have any additional questions, I will open up the conversation to feedback that within Blackboard, the challenge that we now have with downloading assignments. There's still expectation that we provide students with feedback, and some of you are already familiar with that. But we also have another option that students can use Google Docs and upload their assignments as PDFs, and then you download the assignment as a Google Doc and provide feedback that way. Some people are using that, and if you'd like more information on it, I can give you a short tutorial on how to do that as well. In fact, that might be more public than is readily available right now. So I want to thank you for the session and joining us. Mitchell, I got your feedback there, and so if there are any additional questions, I would welcome them. Otherwise, I am signing off for now and letting you go.
Mitch Miller
has left the meeting.
Have a great afternoon.
Has left the meeting.
Glenn Croxton
has left the meeting. A participant has left the meeting.
Linda Myers
has left